I find that the interests of justice require that there be a second trial in the case of People versus Powell.
A new trial is ordered in the Rodney King beating. Are federal charges a sure thing? Today, we'll ask the Attorney General of the United States, William Barr, and we'll talk about the Bush administration's reaction to the riots with a congresswoman whose district was hardest hit, Maxine Waters, with urban economist Jeff Fold, and Republican political consultant Ed Rollins.
No justice, no peace!
The law in Los Angeles, an issue facing the nation.
Face the Nation with Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. And now from CBS News in Washington, Bob Schieffer.
It has been nearly 3 weeks now since the Rodney King verdict, and we're pleased this morning to have the first interview since then with the Attorney General of the United States, William Barr. Mr. Barr, thank you for coming. How close are you to deciding whether or not you are going to bring federal charges, or at least seek federal charges against the officers who were acquitted by the state jury?
Well, Bob, as you know, we have a pending grand jury investigation of that case, and under the law, I'm limited as to what I can say about it. Obviously, anything I could say could jeopardize and undercut any potential future action we take. We have a crackerjack team of prosecutors working on the case. They are going full bore. We know there is a strong public interest in moving quickly. At the same time, it's important that we fully develop the facts of this case and fully build a case. I think the last thing the American people would want is for us to precipitously rush to indictments and then not be able to win that case in court. And so we have to use the grand jury process to build a case.
Well, can I just, I understand what you're saying, but can you give me some sort of a timetable? I mean, surely your prosecutors know, or your investigators know, how close they are to saying, Mr. Attorney General, we're ready to go with this thing, or we're not ready to go with it.
I really can't give you a specific timetable. In fact, the timetable is constantly being revised as we find out more about the case, more about potential witnesses and areas that we want to pin down. I did get a rough estimate last week, but it's subject to change. I'm talking to the prosecutors next week to get a revised assessment. We're moving quickly, but we have to do the job professionally. We have to do it right.
This week, the state judge did decide to go ahead and retry Lawrence Powell, whose case was the one that ended in a hung jury. Now, when the state began its process on all four of the officers, you suspended the federal investigation because you said that was proper while the state moved in. Does this now mean that you will suspend the investigation again, or will this have any effect on the timetable or the process of your own investigators now?
No, the new state trial of Officer Powell will not affect our investigation or our timetable for making a determination as to whether there'll be indictments.
Is there a possibility that you might seek any charges against any other officers other than those four?
All I would say about that, Bob, is that we're looking at the whole incident from ground zero forward. We are not limiting ourselves to any particular set of people.
So there is a possibility there could be more indictments that would include others than the four people who were originally charged in this case.
We're looking at the whole incident. I don't want to speculate as to who might be the subject of an indictment.
If you do bring federal charges against the officers, do you think it's possible they can get a fair trial?
That obviously has to be an area of concern. It certainly concerns me. I think that it is possible that they could get a fair trial. We're certainly going to take every step we can to see that they do, if we decide to go forward with charges. Obviously, I think the defense will raise this issue, and a court will have to make the decision.
Would you, in the federal, if a federal case does come, would you seek a change of venue after what happened in these state cases? Would that bear on your case?
I think it's likely the defense would seek a change in venue.
You would try to try them in Los Angeles if that's where
I
you
don't
did.
want to speculate about potential tactics in a potential case, but I think that it's likely we would see the defense seek a change in venue.
Mr. Barr, I know your investigators have launched an investigation into what connection the gangs in Los Angeles might have had with this riot. What have you found out so far?
Well, we were investigating all the violence, the arson that was involved in the riots. Our preliminary information is that there was significant involvement of gang members at the inception of the violence, also involvement in the spreading of the violence and the arson.
So this would be something that did not necessarily have to do with the Rodney King. It was not a reaction, but was a criminal activity. Is that what you're saying to me?
Yes, I think a lot of the violence and the looting did not have much to do with Rodney King. I think a lot of that kind of activity were the criminal element taking advantage of the situation.
Well, there was a lot of, all kind of stories were going around. One heard things that some of these gangs may have actually had contingency plans, that if these police officers were found not guilty, that they would use that as an excuse to break into gun stores, for example. Have you found any, can you tell us anything about that? Or?
We've heard that information and we're obviously looking into it, but I couldn't substantiate that right now.
What about the guns? There were, what, 3,000 stolen during the riot? Have you recovered any of those yet?
There were 1,200 confirmed stolen, possibly quite a few more. We have started recovering some of those firearms, but obviously most of them are still on the street.
Let me ask you, there is a widely held perception among many people in South Los Angeles that there's kind of a double standard that the government and that the state has employed in all of this. And one of the things they point to is that you suspended your federal investigation of the police officers that beat Rodney King while the state took over that case. And yet, when the people were arrested who beat the truck driver in that notorious incident that was seen, you didn't lay back on that. And the charge they make, of course, is that you want to go as hard as you can against black people, but you're not nearly so interested in seeing justice is done in the case when the black man is the victim. How do you respond to those kind of charges?
We stand for equal justice and equal application of the law. No one's above the law, and we take each case on its merits. The fact is there are some differences and similarities between those two cases, but in fact, it's going to be handled in generally the same way that we handled the Rodney King case. We do intend to let the state charges go forward first. So the state charges against the individuals accused of beating Denny will proceed. We are going to hold our case in abeyance, just as we did with Rodney King.
And you'll hold the investigation also? I mean, you...
Well, what's different here is that we have a joint task force doing the investigation, so there are state and federal investigators mixed up on a joint task force, and they're all working on the same investigation. That's one of the differences here, and that's just because of the way the investigation was structured. But again, the federal government is going to hold its case in abeyance and let the state proceed, just as we did in Rodney King.
Every administration official, Vice President Quayle last week on this broadcast, other officials in other venues, always mention law and order. It's the first word that is talked about when you talk about Los Angeles. What do you think that the lessons of Los Angeles are, and what are the problems that Los Angeles is exposed to the country? Is it a law and order problem? Is it something that goes beyond that?
It's partly and largely a law and order problem, but it does go beyond that too. And I think from at least the law enforcement standpoint, Los Angeles underscores, I think, the message that this administration has been trying to get across on law enforcement. First, that we do have to uphold the rule of law. Violent crime is a serious problem in our country, and the rule of law is essential to holding our country together. We're a diverse country. The glue that holds us together is the rule of law, and it's the foundation upon which we hope to build a better society. Second, that law enforcement alone can't handle the problem of crime, and we do have to work with the community. Law enforcement and the community have to work together in a partnership, and where that happens, you see less of the suspicion between the police and the community, and that's the model we've been pushing. Part of that is community policing, which we've been supporting. And third, that tough law enforcement and social programs to ameliorate the conditions that contribute to crime have to go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. We can't expect social programs to succeed in the city unless there's some tough law enforcement there, because crime is causing poverty these days. It's discouraging investment, discouraging jobs in the inner city. So we have to marry these two approaches, and that's what the President's Weed and Seed program is about.
Well, mentioning Weed and Seed, it's very interesting to me because that program does seem to work where you have tried it out in pilot programs. But one part of that program is that local police have to be able to put enough officers into those areas so they can walk the beat and talk to community leaders. Many departments say they can't participate because they just don't have enough officers, that they're going to have some help to keep the other officers on the beat if they're going to be able to participate in those programs. Can you see a way that the federal government can help them do that beyond what you're already doing? Because without it, many of them say weed and seed just won't be enough.
Right. We are helping now, and in fact, even apart from weed and seed, over the past 2 years, we've supported community policing with grants of $25 million in the 16 weed and seed cities we have now. Most of the money that we're putting in is for community policing, and of course, we'll do all we can to continue to support that. But state and local governments should not be scrimping on law enforcement. I think to the extent they undercut law enforcement, they're frustrating all their other programs. And so now's not the time for cutbacks.
What did you say? I'm sorry.
To the extent they scrimp on law enforcement, they're going to undercut their other programs. If you build housing projects only to see them taken over by drug addicts and drug traffickers, you really haven't advanced the ball. So to the extent you want your general efforts at social rehabilitation and urban renewal to take hold, you're going to have to invest in law enforcement. I think that's one of the problems in Los Angeles, and I'm not criticizing the leadership at this point, but there are only 8,000 policemen in the Los Angeles Police Department. That's the smallest police department per capita for any large city, and given the great area they have, stretched very thin, so they don't have the capacity to build that kind of relationship with the community that has to be established.
One of the things that we find in polling that you hear over and over is that the frustration in the country these days that the government simply seems unable to get anything done. I was thinking about that as I was going back to the clips this week, and I was reminded that the Attorney General Thornburg, before you came to the office, immediately after the King incident was reported and people saw the videotape for the first time, ordered this gargantuan study of police brutality. And yet that study, it's a year later and the study's never been released. Why is that?
Well, the study is still underway, and the initial data from the Civil Rights Division was so spotty and incomplete that we couldn't draw any conclusions from it, and so that was fed over to the National Institute of Justice, which now has 2 studies that are contracted out, and we expect them in the fall. But I'd like to make a broader point to the point you just...
Let me just, before you make your broader point, let me wait. Doesn't that kind of embarrass you that the government, it takes the government a year to find out if there's police brutality? I mean, and you still haven't gotten it done? I mean, isn't that what frustrates people? They say every time something happens, well, we're going to have a big study, and it goes on for a year, and nothing ever happens.
Well, the study isn't to find out whether there's police brutality. We know there is police brutality. It's reprehensible. It's still the exception, not the rule. What the study is trying to do is get at the root causes of police brutality and look as to what kinds of factors in a police department, the training, the operations of internal affairs, the screening of police officers, how we can change these things to cut down on police brutality. And it doesn't embarrass me that takes some time to do.
It would seem to me you ought to be able to get something of a handle on it in a year.
Well, the data that we have here at the federal level is very incomplete. I mean, it's very hard for us to sort out, for example, which are the valid complaints and which aren't. It doesn't tell you very much to say there's so many complaints per 1,000 arrests.
I think that's one thing you and I will just have to disagree on. Mr. Attorney General, thank you very much for coming today. Pleasure to have you. We'll be back in a minute with a roundtable.